Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці з фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Львівської міської ради запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 5 по 9 жовтня 14-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень, плекаючи спільне благо разом до сталого розвитку суспільства.
Як спільними зусиллями досягати цілей сталого розвитку та будувати справедливий світ?
Як зберегти довкілля, біорізноманіття, екосистеми суші та води? Як адаптувати міста до змін клімату?
Які перспективи європейський зелений курс відкриває Україні? Яка роль бізнесу у розвитку суспільства? Як сучасна церква сприяє сталому розвитку? Крізь призму екології, економіки, інклюзії та екуменічного соціального вчення досліджуємо цілі сталого розвитку разом.
Реєстрація та деталі на сайті isweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається онлайн.
Вітаю всіх учасників.
Welcome to all the participants of our third session of the Ukrainian Christian Academic Society. We are having our third session today. We've been dealing with issues of martyria, the notion of martyria in different contexts, and since this year's Ecumenical Week is development to the sustainable development, we decided to dedicate this session to yet another aspect of martyrdom, this kind of witnessing the righteousness that is expressed, manifested in different ways. Righteousness as the defense of the human rights, righteousness as the defense of the environment, as combating for human rights, different aspects of human lives where people who are saints and righteous people somehow reveal themselves and witness faith. So out of this notion of martyrdom that has transformed into martyrdom solely, we are trying to deal with different sides, from different sides. And our today's session is dedicated to the topic that is closest to our general umbrella topic about sustainable development. We are having today 4 speakers. We have simultaneous interpretation. Those who will be listening to Ukrainian, please look at the bottom, at the button at the bottom. You have English and Ukrainian to choose.
Our translation in English, please go to the button interpretation, mark with the globe. Choose the language English and stay on that language until the end of our session. Okay. Спочатку ми будемо
First, our session will be opened by our guest who came over to us from the United States of America, Dr. Adam Seligman, a very interesting person who works as a professor of religion at the Boston University. He is Professor of Religion and Research Associate at the Institute on Culture, Religion and World Affairs. He used to live in Israel. He was a fellow of Fulbright Fellowship. For a couple of years, he lived in Israel and was a participant of kibbutz. Now he published several books that were translated into many languages, and is also director of the organization Seder, who deals with diversities and religion. It is characterized by conducting international summer schools every year in a different country, and these summer schools are raising issues that are the most relevant in this or another society. And we hope that in a year, such summer school will take place here with us. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to begin with a story. I have a very dear friend, a priest in Kampala, Uganda, with whom I've had an ongoing discussion for more than a decade now on the value and importance of the biblical injunctions of leket and peah. That is, the prohibition to remove the gleanings of your field that had fallen from your hand, but to leave them, as well as the unharvested corner of your field, for the poor. The fact that these are legal injunctions, laws to be obeyed, rather than the free offerings of your heart, bothers my friend very much. Far better, he said, that such charity be voluntarily offered rather than legally mandated. Better for whom, I usually ask. And here we come to the crux of the matter. For him, concerned as he is with the salvation of the soul, for the salvation of the soul of the individual farmer, it is much better for his own salvation to make a voluntary offering of charity rather than have it commanded by law. This may indeed be true. I am not privy to the soteriological intricacies of a soul's journey. However, I'm pretty well convinced that from the perspective of the poor and the needy, of the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, it is much better to have such support and guarantee of what we today would call food security, to have this mandated by law rather than left to the ever-changing vagaries of an individual heart. My argument, however, with Max is not over personal preferences. It is really over social priorities and ultimate perspectives. That of individual salvation or that of social justice and well-being. It is, of course, very relevant today. If we look at my own country, for instance, to extensive debates between Republicans and Democrats over welfare entitlements. The Republicans argue that charity is an individual choice, a matter between the individual and his or her conscience. The Democrats argue for a legally mandated social obligation to help to help the needy, the downtrodden, the stranger, and those in need. Such obligations to our fellows are not matter of individual conscience. Rather, they are human obligations which we must take up as part and parcel of all other obligations and duties incumbent on human beings. If we step back a moment and frame these different priorities of mine and of Max analytically, we can state that they are essentially run on two different axes. The one transcendent, the other social. Thus along vertical and horizontal axes. This, I would claim, has great relevance to our topic of righteousness. A concept, by the way, that does not really exist in Judaism. And I will attempt to explain in this talk why this is so. To begin, we can well ask, where is righteousness to be found? Is it to be found along the vertical or the horizontal axis? Or both? We may recall here the Reformation critique of Catholicism for its doctrine of works, that is, for its legalism. In this reading, the social or horizontal axis can only attain to righteousness when it moves beyond legal demands to supererogatory action. In this reading, only when we move beyond what is legally mandated can we move from the horizontal to the vertical, from the social to the transcendence, and thus attain to righteous conduct. For righteousness is to be found along the vertical axis. This, of course, was the argument of my friend the priest in Africa. Righteousness is beyond the law. It is separate from social horizontal concerns and can be found only in our relation to transcendence. What I wish to present here is the idea that in Judaism, there are not two axes, but only one. One axis that is both horizontal and vertical. Man cannot exist in the presence of God outside of community, and he cannot exist in community outside or without the presence of God. Thus, we exist in a web or network of relations with God, with others, and with the world. We are thus not confronted with an individual looking forward at the social world and looking up at a heavenly one. Rather, we are confronted with a human agent existing in a web of multiple relations. Within this web, law is not, as it is so often caricatured, a set of prohibitions. Law is rather a regulatory code. It is a map of being. Similarly, and critically, sorry about that. Similarly and critically, sin in Judaism is not an ontological state, but quite simply a mistake. Mistakes may be more or less serious, with dire or less dire consequences. But that is all they are. They're a mistake. Sin, chet, in Hebrew, quite literally means to miss the mark, as if you're shooting an arrow and you miss the bullseye. It is not, to repeat, a state of being. It is rather a thing done wrongly, and so may be corrected. Sin is not an ontological state, and so too law is less in its essence a set of prohibitions and more, as I say, a regulatory code. It regulates what I may eat, and so what and how I may kill to eat, my relations with the world. It regulates my duties to other human beings, the point at which we began with leket and peah, and it regulates my duties to God in prayer, observance of holidays, Sabbath, and so on. It is all one intimately connected set of relations in which I am one point of connection, united with others, similarly connected in a holy community. A nation of priests in the biblical idiom, Exodus 19:6, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It is true that there is in Jewish law the notion of lifnim mishirat hadin, translated as beyond the line or beyond the measure of the law, and taken by some modern commentaries to indicate ethical behavior somehow beyond the law. Indeed, contemporary liberal writers often make use of the notion of lifnim mishirat hadin as providing extra halachic standard by which halacha, the corpus of Jewish law, may itself be judged. But none of the 9 examples given in the Talmud of lifnim mishirat hadin are those concerning following the dictates of conscience in violation of the law. At most, they refer to the waiver of certain benefits that may accrue to one in matters of tort law in favor of neighborliness and upstanding behavior. Righteousness in Judaism is found within the law and its observance and not beyond. Indeed, we are commanded to follow the law, not to subtract to it, but also not to add to it. That such an approach poses a continual challenge, we know from no less a thinker than St. Paul, who developed a world-transforming alternative. But for those of us who remain within the holy community and try to observe the law, it is in its intricacies that righteousness is to be found. Perhaps the final word about lifnim mishirat hadin was given by the 13th century thinker Nachmanides in his commentary on verse 18 of chapter 6 in Deuteronomy, where it says, do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. She made a mistake. For Nachmanides, this is direct reference to both the need to compromise in human relations and to the notion of lifnim mishirat hadin, which he sees as seeking proper action in circumstances not explicitly defined by the law. For after all, human actions and their interactions are infinite, while the explicit rulings on Sinai are limited. Now, do you want me to continue? Because I didn't think of the translation, or should I stop? You tell me. I didn't figure the time of translation.
You just speak. You don't have to wait. Yes, of course, it's simultaneous interpretation. You may speed up.
Okay, then let me turn this off because I find it distracting. So let us now look at those explicit rulings to exemplify my earlier point on the relational web of God and community and the individual, and the role of law within that web. While we can easily find rabbinic examples, such as the dictum of wherever two Jews study the law, God is present, I want to go instead to the Torah itself, to the Pentateuch, to the portion we call Kitetse, which is Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 25, and its concern with the captive, the poor, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the weak, and the innocent. The laws in this section of Deuteronomy demand us to keep honest weights and measures, to maintain human dignity, especially in respect to our parents, neighbors, to the socially marginalized, to strangers, widows, and orphans, to those who are employed by us. They remind us of our own slavery in Egypt and the obligations to others that devolve upon us in consequence of that slavery. We can, moreover, usefully divide the many ethical injunctions of this reading in two. Both are rabbinic, both are Tanaitic, that is, 2nd century of the Christian era. They're not mentioned per se in the text, but they exemplify my point. The one we may term Kvod HaBriot encompasses almost all the ethical injunctions listed in this section of the Torah, and with it the demands of righteousness according to Jewish understanding. Kvod HaBriot is concerned with the dignity of women and of men, both in their physical as well as in their social selves. Rabbinic injunctions against stripping an individual who is wearing shatnez, that is cloth made of wool and linen together, which is prohibited. The prohibitions of stripping somebody of such clothing in the market is an example of Kvod HaBriot. For in leaving him without clothing, he would incur shame. Similarly, the permission to violate some Sabbath rules to maintain an individual's bodily dignity, let alone health, is also a rabbinic ruling that fits this understanding. And just to give you a recent example, in the early stages of COVID, in ultra-Orthodox, very religious communities in New York, when people thought donating plasma could help COVID patients, the rabbis told their community to drive hundreds of kilometers to donate plasma to communities, to non-Jewish communities that need it. Violating Sabbath is unimaginable, and they said you should do it. So this is what I'm saying. Kvod HaBriot is, moreover, universal in its ramifications. Perhaps the most important of these is the notion of met mitzvah, the demand, injunction to bury an anonymous corpse found in the field. Beyond this notion is the idea of universal human dignity or honor that is both corporeal and social. It is not concerned with rights so much as with honor, with entitlements so much as with dignity. We are explicitly warned against causing shame or impugning human dignity, understood both in reference to our existence in our body as well as in society. Together with Kvod HaBriot, this section of the Torah presents us with another principle as well, Tselem Elokim, man in the image of God, also a Tanaitic notion, but of a slightly different import. This principle appears as an absolute injunction not to let the corpse of an executed criminal remain on the stake overnight, but to bury it on the day of execution. for leaving it would be, quote, an affront to God. Now, in direct reference to this text, we find in Tosefta Sanhedrin that 3rd century rabbi asks, what does for that which is hanged as a reproach to God teach us? And he tells the following story. There are two twins who were like one another in appearance. One became king of the world, while the other went off and consorted with thieves. After a time, the latter was captured and crucified on a cross, and all who came and went said, it is as though the king were crucified. Therefore it is said, for that which is hanged is a reproach to God. This notion of tselem, of man as an image of God, appears often in shaping rabbinic norms. For example, we have in Tosefta Yevamot, Rabbi Akiva saying, he who sheds blood negates the image. For it says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. We have as well a text repeated actually 3 different places, in Torat Kohanim, in Yerushalmi, in Breshit Rabbah, where Ben Azai, arguing with Rabbi Akiva, claims that the most profound verse in the Torah is not love thy neighbor as thyself, but this is the book of the generations of man. In the day that the Lord created man in the image of God, he made him. The version of Breshit Rabbah goes on to have Ben Azai challenge Rabbi Akiva, claiming that to follow his ruling of loving your neighbor as yourself, in this case, you could be cursed and shamed, so the other person could also be cursed and shamed in principle. Look, however, who would be cursed and shamed, Ben Azai exclaims, the image of God. In the above, then, a very different notion of Kvod HaBriot. We no longer man's social or purely physical status, but the idea that we stand in an iconic relation to God. And the rabbis interpret tselem and dmut in the Greek words of icon and diokon. Acts which diminish man's image, the shedding of blood, negate the image of God that is present in us. Thus, we have here 2 independent foundations for human dignity. The one predicated on our sentient humanness, and the other on our likeness to God. The horizontal and the vertical are here as elsewhere inexorably interlinked. Our duties are to both, duties that are within the law, that is our only path to righteousness. A righteousness of a community, and so of an individual within this community. Together, to fulfill the words of the prophet Isaiah, I quote, from chapter 49, it is too little that you should be my servant, in that I raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will also make you a light of nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Thank you for your patience.
Дякуємо, професоре, за вашу доповідь. Ми так по-новому зрозуміли взаємовідносини між Богом, людиною.
Thank you for your presentation. We had a new chance to reassess and understand in a new way the complicated relations between the community, God, and an individual. A human being, an individual, can go beyond the dimension of law. And now we pass the floor to Reverend Dr. Mikhailo Demid, who is professor of the Department of Pastoral Theology at the Department of Philosophy and Theology at UCU. Plus, now he will be rather speaking as a witness of events in Maidan that he experienced very closely while he was in Kiev in Maidan, and we will hear his theological reflections. His topic is entitled Martyria as common witness to the truth during Revolution of Dignity. Thank you. Glory to Jesus Christ. I'm happy to see all the participants of the social week. I'm glad that you invited me. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to give testimony of martyrdom taking place during the Revolution of Dignity, in particular in the Kiev Maidan, and not only. Martyria is a gift that we receive from the Holy Ghost. In other words, we cannot ourselves sort out how to do something extraordinary without God's help. Martyry has to take place in the course of action. It's not that we, sit and in the sitting position become suddenly heroes. Martyry is taking place usually without one's special desire for this. Of course, we know some righteous people like Metropolitan Szymtycki, who was asking God to provide him chances for martyrdom. So if God requires from him martyrdom, he is ready for this. But in the majority of cases, those who make big sacrifices, they do this gradually, starting from little steps. When you learn on the little level how to sacrifice, then they can be granted new chances to make bigger sacrifices. This is not, something like a straw catches fire and it happens at once. One needs to develop certain skills, and that's why martyrdom requires certain efforts. It requires having an idea, to being an idealist. Martyrdom requires prayer. Prayer in the sense of communio. It's communio with the transcendental world, because inspiration and courage and love with which one can do all this, they all come from God. Martyrdom cannot live in hatred. If there is hatred, it's not about martyrdom. Hatred cannot become a stimulus for martyrdom. It should be an expression of altruism, not of egotism. And usually, as we say in our Christian tradition, God usually precedes martyrdom with confession. And if it ends with the full sacrifice of life, it becomes martyrdom. But even confessing, witnessing is itself already a stage of martyrdom. And two more points. Martyria has an inalienable inside joy. It encompasses the horizontal and vertical dimensions of life. So witnessing truth begins when one faces truth, and truth is God. This is where we come to in our Christian tradition, through baptism, through prayer, through encompassing the transcendental. And in the circumstances of Maidan, for many, meeting the transcendence, facing the transcendence became very real. Some of people met this transcendental before Maidan, some during the Maidan events, and some even after. And only when one meets God, can men do things that we can call part of martyrdom. During Maidan, a very significant moment was sacrifice in Holy Liturgy, when dozens of hundreds and thousands of people would gather around the tent where the liturgy was, and people would bring their offerings. In the same tent, we had this transfiguration of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And that's when the divine martyria was tightly united with human martyria. It was the moment when what human beings were offering became holy, it became noble, it became permeated with real sense, not only worldly, but also transcendental sense. And thus, we can say that every volunteer service, if it's altruistic in Maidan, since it requested an unusual amount of effort, could be considered as a martyr. In other words, this is readiness to sacrifice oneself in order to defend freedom, to favor justice, to make sure that human beings encompass their truly fleeting dignity. And for Christians, this is their direct duty, to love their neighbor like they love themselves. In other words, this is a way to encompass the divine. For instance, the youth that were constructing defensive constructions, different hundreds in the Maidan, that as we called them. Why were they doing this? They were doing this, first of all, to make sure that if the governmental official powers would attack people, in that case, there would be some kind of defense for those innocent people so that they would have time to flee. So, people who went to the barricades were not going to attack, and neither to defend themselves, but to protect the people who were standing in Maidan. This is a significant altruistic moment. We can also speak about those who were healing and treating people medically, who were cooking, and so on and so on. It's significant that each of them was on high spirit, consciously or unconsciously. And one of the proofs of this elevated look at the world was an hourly prayer, our Heavenly Father, that was taking place every hour, every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in this prayer, whether knowingly or unknowingly, some people may have even not known the words, but all the people associated themselves with this prayer. This is a significant moment for understanding that martyria is when human beings have elevated look, and they look at the sky, they look at heaven, and they act not out of their own strength, but also out of the strength received from above. One of the examples from the Holy Scriptures would be from the first book of the Shmuel. In the 18th chapter, we read about Saul, who goes against Goliath. we read about King David. The same happened in Maidan. There was another kind of martyria, which is called standing on a column, like you know, the Simeon the stylism, we can call it. Many people were standing on Maidan, and through this standing, people were being theodized. They were thinking what was the sense of their action, what was the sense of their death, what was their sense of helping their neighbor. And this was something that was giving them impetus and the additional internal power to go forward without fearing negative human results and consequences, because one has to take into account that this all was happening according to the dictatorship laws illegally. According to then existing dictatorship laws, that all was considered illegal. And such courage, such certainty, and such positive spirit, they all speak of the spirit of martyria. Our people and we are Christians. This all was encouraging us to become radical Christians, as once Ivan Franko would write. Christian radicalism, not directed against someone, not out of hatred, but the image of that Christian radicalism was supported by Lubomir Huzar. He mentioned rigid and a position with principles, but at the same time with love. It's also martyria. And this kind of behavior from Patriarch Lubomir was an attitude and behavior that I would say 95% of Maidan participants had, because there was not a single broken window in a store. Just imagine something similar happening in any European capital city. That is also very significant for us. Faith, hope, love, freedom, authority, respect for authority, service, trust, dignity, charity, human's face. All these are manifestations of martyria. There is a notion Euro Maidan, and there is a notion revolution of dignity. And there was a transition from the Euro Maidan to the revolution of dignity. In other words, out of these moments of reacting to the unconsequential and anti-Ukrainian activities on behalf of then President Yanukovych, it all was transformed into another stage with different values and aims and goals, and it really grew to the level of martyria with a far-looking perspective. that was not going to end with, a fiasco of one party, but should end with the internal transformation of every Ukrainian, whether he was or was not a participant of Maidan. Maybe he or she is in the process of this transformation, or maybe will undergo it, but it will be a new Ukrainian will learn from the experience of our new heroes that will be recognized. The biggest image, not only image, but also real offering of sacrifice, is the heavenly 100. And each person out of this heavenly 100, out of love for one's neighbor, left their life in Maidan. Church is currently struggling with a problem. What's to be done with the people who perished in Maidan? Because church has to seek divine reasonings why someone would die for the other, for the neighbor. And with regular techniques and methods that were used to prove, that you had to make a sign of cross or confess that you confess Jesus Christ. So this is not the case. So you have to find the internal call in everyone to serve to the neighbor, and that this service grew out of faith in God, and then from God received this inspiration to act this way. And this leads to a martyrdom. But this martyrdom is a very significant element for constructing the future of our society. This is also a critical element for building a new nation, a new people. And for understanding that, yes, this is possible, to act positive, to act with courage, to have your own identity, your position, not to fear the sacred, thus not to act just according to the book and according to the law, but first of all and above all, according to the spirit of the law. Is not possible. It's not possible without martyrdom to deal just according to the law. You cannot apply laws just for the welfare of the society. Another manifestation of martyria, and this is where I probably will end, is, how shall I put it? It's when the churches started to refuse to leave behind their egotism. Maidan and the sacred spirit that was evolving there contributed to the fact that the church was not thinking only about itself, but was opening wide doors eyes and hearts to God, just straight to God. So our mediation is significant, but there are moments when we can act without this mediation, and it may be even better. And so it happened. Those who were in Maidan were able to feel this very heartily and deep in their hearts, so that the church, through the martyry, the service, full opening to God, became indeed the community that merged with the society. Regardless of what religion or even non-religious those people were, church was one with them. Church was together with them, moving forward. Where? To the high, to the heavenly highs. And together with them, the church was creating a new ideology, in the positive sense, ideology of a new Ukrainian nation that finally managed to Ukrainize its state. And the state will be following this way, not only now, but later. So it determined the way for the state. Martyria, search of truth, took place in Maidan. But in order to be, how shall I put it, life-giving, it has to continue, and continue with such courage and with such heartedness and with such nobility as it was taking place in Maidan. And this will be a secret of Ukraine's success in future. And this will be a secret of Ukraine's people contribution into Europe of the future, where Ukraine will be able to pass over this sacred moment that is helping people to overcome themselves in regular and extraordinary circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you very much for the testimony that you are giving, because you are closely related to these events. Thank you for having shared your perspective on various manifestations of martyria on the Maidan. Thank you for the spiritual characteristics that you elucidated. I was mostly impressed by your statement that martyria should be interpreted and understood as a gift, that you cannot really predict it or anticipate it. This is something that you have to be ready for, but we need to understand and perceive martyria as a gift of God. Thank you very much, Father. And I want to give the floor to Dr. Roman Solovey. He is a PhD in theology, head of the Eastern European Institute of Theology, professor of theology and religious studies at the Drohomanov National Pedagogical University. Dr. Solovey will be talking about two people, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Andrea Tragma. They were Protestant pastors. And the title of his presentation is Sanctity and the Practice of Nonviolence in the Context of Dehumanization. Thank you, Taras. If you allow me, I will read out my presentation. This way we will be able to save some time. I really hope for that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Andrea Tragma, Sanctity and the Practice on Nonviolence in the Context of Decommunication. The first half of the 20th century is an extremely challenging and period, the period of radical transformations. And this period was characterized by two world wars, the collapse of the empires. The entire European map was dissected and reshuffled, and some new totalitarian political regimes were insurgent. In the conditions of losing the value of human life and dignity, the church was a silent witness and sometimes even an accomplice in the most atrocious crimes. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Andrea Tragma belong to the list of those Protestant pastors, thanks to whom we can state that even in hopeless conditions, Christians can be loyal to the gospel convictions and values. These two people had some commonalities and differences. They were born in well-off families belonging to the upper middle class in the early 20th century. But Tragma came from a family of French merchants, and they cherished the Calvinist tradition, and they also cherished the value of ascetic serving to the God. While Bonhoeffer grew up in a highly intellectual Lutheran family, so they were quite cold towards religion. They both experienced the crisis of World War I. Bonhoeffer lost his brother. He died in the spring of 1918 in the Western Front, while the family of Tragma was very struggling during the German occupation. The two of them decided to sacrifice themselves and serve the church, but there are some differences here as well. Tragma did not really graduate from his doctor's studies, while Bonhoeffer, at the age of 21, received his doctor's dissertation, and he was habilitated at the Berlin University. The two of them, through various pathways, came to some pacifist convictions, and this is something that they adhered to until the end of their lives. They felt this injustice, they realized the value of human life, and they could not be indifferent. Despite loyalty to confessional traditions and communities, they still tried to voluntarily assume the role of dissidents, weirdos, and martyrs. Both Bonhoeffer and Tragma were persecuted for their anti-Nazi activities. Tragma experienced some arrests and underground activities, and he survived when France was liberated, while Bonhoeffer participated in the resistance movement, and he was executed on the 9th of April 1945. Back then he was 39 years of age. It should be noted that regardless of the heroic actions of the pastors before and during World War II, recognition was given to Tragma and Bonhoeffer only several decades after the end of the war. The German and the French societies wanted to forget about the war atrocities, and they also wanted to forget about the terrible moral compromises that the Germans and the French had to agree to during the war times. By these moral issues, I mean the Jewish issue in the first place. Both Bonhoeffer and Tragma criticized the deprivation of the Jews of civil rights and freedoms, but they had a different interpretation. Andrea, his wife Magda, and the entire community of the Les Chambon area were recognized the righteous among the nations, while Bonhoeffer, despite multiple requests to the Yad Vashem, was not designated as the righteous among the nations because ostensibly his heroic death had nothing to do with the rescue of the Jews. Let me start with Andrea Tragma. In 1940-1944, the residents of several villages in a remote mountainous district of the southern central France initiated a quiet but compromise-free resistance to the Vichy government, and they rescued the lives of about 5,000 refugees, including 3,500 Jews. Gripped by war, this group created an underground safe haven for Christian love, and they opened their doors to the refugees from all over Europe. So they realized very well that if Gestapo revealed their activities, they would be subjected to deportations and executions, but still their common decision was to keep their loyalty to the gospel and example of Christ. The key persons in this pacifist movement were Andrea Tragma and his wife Magda. During post-war interviews, residents of these villages never described their actions as a manifestation of heroic deeds. Most often, they would just say that whenever pastor had to answer why they were involved in underground activities, they would just say, these people came for shelter and haven to me. I'm their pastor, and I cannot really leave my herd behind. So I don't really know what the Jew means. I only know what a human being means. Behind these words, there was a difficult history of the French Reformist Church. For centuries, it was subjected to persecutions and the deprivations of civil rights. So this minority was persecuted on a perpetual basis. But the fact that the Chambon-Lignon community decided to participate in the rescue of victims was related to the activities of Andrea Tragma, the memory of the German occupation during World War II, some worries because of the internal conflict, the fact that his mom was a German, and his work in youth Christian groups. All these convictions created some obstacles on the pathway of his social serving. And as a result, his position was not disseminated. And as a result, he found himself in Chambon in 1934. After the defeat of France in the summertime of 1940, and when the collaboration government of Vichy was established in the south of the country, the tragic history of Jews commenced, because Jews were isolated from the rest of the society. They were suspended from enterprises and public authorities. Their property was confiscated. They were sent to camps. Both French citizens and foreign Jews were suffering. Under such conditions, the Chambon community set up an entire network of hidden shelters. They hid Jews and other persecuted, and they then sent them to the neighboring Switzerland. And despite the threats of the Gendarmerie and Gestapo, this rescue network worked until the liberation of France. The peacekeeping activities of Pastor Tragma were not limited to the period of occupation. In between the world wars, he actively participated in organizing marches for peace. He sought to achieve reconciliation between the German and French peoples. And after the end of World War II, he started working in the camps for the German prisoners of war. And he was criticized by a lot of citizens who were ready to execute these prisoners. After the war, Andrea and Magda cooperated with the international movement for reconciliation. They fought against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and they also were mediators in the resolution of military conflicts, in particular in Algiers. Their rejection of violence created a lot of hype. It's known that Magda Tragma had a meeting with Martin Luther King, and Andrea's publications had an impact on multiple theologians. In 1971, Andrea, and in 1984, Magda were designated the righteous among the nations. Basically, this is a title granted to non-Jews who rescued Jews in the times of the Holocaust. And now I would like to draw your attention to the German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. 2 months after Hitler came to power, on the 7th of April 1933, the law was adopted in Ukraine on the renovation of the public service, and this law imposed a ban on people of non-Aryan origin to occupy public posts. Bonhoeffer insisted on non-tolerance to anti-Semitism, in particular in the church life, because according to this law, baptized Jews were not able to serve as pastors, and they were not really able to be exposed to the church gifts. But unfortunately, Bonhoeffer was not really able to publicly make his statements. On the 11th of April 1933, the father of Gerhard Leibgolz, Dietrich sister's husband, died, and despite his Jewish origin, Gerhard's father visited the church, and he considered himself a Lutheran. The pastor decided not to lead a burial ceremony. Later, Bonhoeffer felt really sorry about that, and he apologized to his sister and even helped them leave Germany. Why did he say no to this burial liturgy? Because he was loyal to the Protestant Church of Germany. At the same time, it should be noted that together with his friend, Jew Franz Gildenbrand, Bonhoeffer fought against pro-Nazi German Christians, and their attempts to enforce these Arian laws into the Protestant Church. On the 15th of April 1933, Bonhoeffer published an essay entitled "The Church and the Jewish Issue." And in this publication, he tried to conduct a theological analysis of the Jewish policy of the Nazi government. In this publication, he differentiated between the attitude of the church towards new and political Jewish issue and the baptism of Jews, because he believed that each branch has to perform their own duty. The task of the Jews, of the church, is to proclaim the gospel, while the task of the government is to ensure public order, justice, and law. Bonhoeffer believed that the church didn't really have to make any steps in this regard, because the church was not a humanitarian or association, but the most loyal servant to the government. But if the government takes actions that jeopardize the proclamation of the church, then the church has no right to be silent. The application of these Arian laws was not the competence of the church, but the church had to fight for the truth of reconciliation among all the peoples. And as a response to this new legislation, Bonhoeffer proposed three options. First of all, the church can ask the government whether its actions are legal. Second of all, it can provide assistance to the victims of this public policy, even if they were not part of the Christian community. And the third option implied some direct political actions. According to Bonhoeffer, not only should the church help the victims who were thrown under the bus, but they should also stop the bus. But this radical action can be made only providing that the government does not perform its functions of ensuring law, justice, and public order. The attitude of Bonhoeffer towards the Jews is based on the traditional Lutheran interpretation of the fate of the Jewish people. And even though Christians should support both groups, their brotherly attitude should be expressed only towards converted Jews. These views of Bonhoeffer were modified in the next 12 years, and over time Bonhoeffer expressed more solidarity with the Jews despite their religious convictions. In April 1933, because of his loyalty to the church and Lutheran tradition, Bonhoeffer refused to bury a Jew, but later he started professing the solidarity in Christ with all the Jews. In 1933, Bonhoeffer was a co-author of one publication, quote, "Any nation can be delegated the task of retaliating on the Jews for the murder on the Golgotha." In November 1938, right after the Crystal Night, Bonhoeffer found his students discussing the burning of a local synagogue. And as per the Lutheran tradition, they interpreted this burning as the cursing for the crucifixion of Christ. Bonhoeffer was convinced that it was a pure manifestation of violence, and he also said that if the synagogues are being destructed today, then the churches will be on fire tomorrow. His closest friend, Eberhard Bethe, assumed that that was when Bonhoeffer said his most famous words: "Only the one who cries for the Jews can be singing Gregorian chorals." In the early 1940s, Bonhoeffer recognized his personal and collective guilt of the Christian church for whatever was happening in Germany. He wrote, the church was silent when it was necessary to scream because the blood of the innocent was crying out to the sky. It was not able to say what was necessary in the right time, in the right place. And as a result, an infinite number of innocent people were subjected to physical and spiritual suffering. So the church, is guilty of the death of the weakest and the least protected brothers of Jesus Christ. It should be noted that Bonhoeffer did not always espouse pacifist views. When he was an assistant pastor in the German community, in his sermons, he would make references to blood, soil, and motherland. So basically, he glorified the old German gods of the war. He basically took into account the learnings of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and he tried to call for the conquering of other countries. But he made friends with Christian pacifists such as Lasser and Gildenbrand. He also had meetings with Christian peacekeepers during his internship in the US, and he was inspired to have a completely different interpretation of the gospel. As a result, in the early 1930s, Bonhoeffer started criticizing and condemning any manifestations of violence. By the way, I would like to remind you that before the Second World War, those people who did not want to serve in the army because of their convictions were viewed as criminals. So by the German Protestant Church, he was proclaimed as the enemy of the nation, and he was deprived of the right to give sermons and to make public speeches and statements. It's easy to understand why Bonhoeffer's decision to join the conspiracy of the other officers was accompanied by doubts and internal struggle. His role was to maintain contacts with the British government through the network of ecumenical contacts. He still viewed any murder as a sin, and he was even ready to get rid of his pastoral position. But Bonhoeffer also joined the resistance movement because he was disappointed in the institutional church. Bonhoeffer came to the conviction that the German Protestant establishment, by supporting the Nazi ideology, lost any connection with the historical Christianity. Bonhoeffer had some hopes for changes in the German church through the cooperation with the ecumenical movement, but that did not happen. The German Protestant church continued its manifestations of violence. Therefore, the only way to stop violence was to have a different government in Germany, and it was also important to reach peace agreements with the participants of the anti-Hitler coalition. Bonhoeffer wrote some letters in the prison. They were translated into Ukrainian, by the way, and in these letters he wrote that Christ exists only for the others. And that means for the church that you need to enter the life of others. You need to help other people. You need to serve them with the sacrifice, and you need to reject any intent of self-preservation and power. So his participation in the resistance movement can be viewed as an act of solidarity, and his readiness to even pay the price of his life to rescue Germany. Let me draw some conclusions. Tragma and Bonhoeffer, through various pathways, realized the importance of rejection of violence. The French pastor interpreted the Old Testament and its laws as guidance for action. And by the way, Tragma viewed the laws about the Jubilee year and the mountain sermon of the Christ as guidance for action. He said a flat no to any participation of the Christians in the military service, even if the service did not imply the use of weapons. In the periods of humanitarian catastrophes, the church should resort to practical actions. The church should be the first friend of all the victims of violence and injustice, and the task of the church is to attempt and restore peace. Bonhoeffer's pacifism was grounded in the traditional Lutheran attention for Christology, and it was all about being as activity, which meant that ethical norms and ideals of the Christians had to be determined by the life of the Christ, and the Christ encouraged us to love our animals. Bonhoeffer's and Tragma's pacifism was not really a form of quietism, indifferent disconnection, or empty moralizing. It was a conscious identification with the victims of persecution. They realized that it was important to take hands-on practical steps. It was even worthy confrontation with the government. All this was necessary for the sake of rescuing the life of others. And at the very end, I would like to briefly mention that Andrea Tragma was influenced significantly by his wife Magda. She was of Italian origin, and she espoused some rational views. She did not really share some of the religious convictions of his husband, but she wrote in her memoirs that she had trust and faith in her husband, and she was also a radical supporter of the practice of non-violence. Post-World War II, she gave multiple interviews, and she talked about those people who came to villages and tried to find rescue at the home of the pastor. And she shared a story of one Jewish woman. She was the first one to knock on their door. It was in the winter time. She was dressed up in summer clothes. She was wet. She was freezing, and when Magda was asked during an interview, why did you let her in? You were in violation of the legislation. You jeopardized your household. And she gave a very simple answer. She was in front of my door. She was knocking on my door. I could not be indifferent to that. And so I think that the experience of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Andrea Tragma is very relevant and valuable to all of us, because basically it's a testament to the fact that the church, even in dire and radical conditions, can and should remain loyal to the thought and ethical values that we can see enshrined in the gospel. Thank you. Thank you, Roman, for two wonderful examples of serving people, how martyrdom can be manifested through serving people. It's easier to serve those who are representatives of your community. Much more difficult is it to do this when they are marginalized and don't belong to your community. Moreover, when you have to float against the strait, and you also face the resistance from your brothers, from your community. And you showed us how their attitude changed throughout their life, and how we can today follow them. We have wonderful translations of their works. Thank you for these wonderful examples. Now we have our last presentation from Reverend Oleg Gindi, Dr. Oleg Gindi, who is Associate Professor of the UCU Department of Theology, head of the NGO Center for Ecotheology and Sustainable Development. We are going to talk about another manifestation of martyria. I would say on the example of one of the biggest saints in Catholic Church from medieval times, Francis of Assisi, and he really venerated the beauty of the universe and the nature as a gift of God that we have to understand, comprehend, and express gratitude. So he is a wonderful inspiration for ecologists, those who are dealing with environmental issues, those who take care of environment. So this is the gift that we have to pass over to next generations. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the organizers of this wonderful social week. We've had already a couple of very intensive and relevant events, and I am honored to join this feast of exchanging opinions. And today I would like to talk about the ecological ethics of Francis of Assisi. Saint Francis of Assisi is often portrayed as a medieval figure that sentimentally loved nature, talked to birds, preached gospel to the fish, saved life to a worm who was crossing the road. But Francis's perception of the created world is not just about romanticism and sentimentalism. He rather perceives the whole world from the point of view of the prism of relations between God and his creation. In these relations, the central role is paid to the fact that Francis and the Franciscan tradition is called the primacy of Christ, according to which the Son of God was incarnated not only for saving human being from sin, but because the world was designed from the very beginning, even before the act of creation, as such that would become a repository for God, a receptacle for God. On the other hand, since God is a community of eternal communication between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the whole world is just a representation of his relations of freedom, love, mutual understanding, and care. And from these relations between God and creation, we have to understand the Franciscan ecological ethics. The research of the historical figure of Francis went through different stages of historical rigorism. Just as theologians in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century did colossal work in order to understand who was the so-called historical Jesus. Since the legends and the medieval understanding and perception, and also the changes of intellectual culture in the second millennium really complicate our task to find out what was really the worldview of the Francis of Assisi. But the critical editions of Francis's works and the historical and critical analysis of his works, and also his biggest followers, Bonaventura and Duns Scott, help us to reveal deep religious intuitions, charismatic character. We know that Francis had stigmas, so he received a gift of bearing the signs of the crucified Christ. So I would like to talk today about the ecological ethics that is connected to the other topics that I have mentioned, the Trinity relations and the incarnation of the Word of God. The interest for Francis the Great, the interest for Francis is big not only among the religious researchers, but also among secular authors and historians. When we talk about the ecological crisis, Lynn White, the younger, the junior, is often mentioned. He, in his article dated by 1967, formulated a statement that it is the Judeo-Christian worldview that led to the contemporary global ecological crisis. I quote from his work, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Despite the fact that this statement of White Jr. was several times denied, he has a lot of contemporary followers, such as John Passmore, William Coleman, Graham Hagen, Helen Tiffin, and many others. The main two theses why Judeo-Christian worldview needs to be accused of the contemporary ecological crisis consist in the fact that, first of all, this worldview desacralized the material world. So it showed desacralized material world, that is, put God the Creator above this world, unlike the pre-Christian non-Abraham religions that deified rivers, mountains, animals, natural phenomena, and so on. And secondly, because in the book of Genesis, the human being is depicted as the peak of creation, and God called it just multiply and fill the land and subordinate to yourself everything that you see, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that move in the land. But even White the Junior recognized that maybe, quote, we have to reconsider and reassess the ideas of the biggest radical in Christian history, starting from Christ, that is Saint Francis Assisi. White Junior believes that Francis was not burned in the fire just because the general of the order of Franciscans, Bonaventura, tried to suppress the manifestations of religious views of Francisc. According to White the Junior, Francisc tried to topple down the human being from its monarchic throne and to establish democracy of all divine creatures. He also stated that for Francisc, an end was not just a metaphor to preach to a lazy person, and fire was just a symbol. Was a symbol of human striving for the unity with God. Now they became the brother and the sister fire, and they are themselves glorifying the Creator with their idiosyncratical ways, just like brother human. Francisc preached to birds to reproach people who did not want to hear his sermons. We have also one witness that he was convincing small birds to praise God, and in spiritual ecstasy they were really waving with their wings, and they were happy. White the youngest, White the Junior thinks that Franciscan doctrine of the soul of animals was eradicated. According to him, the study that was partially inspired, whether consciously or not, by the belief in reincarnation that was supported by the heretic Catars, who at that time inhabited in Italy and southern France, and probably borrowed it from India. For White the Junior, it is also significant. Finds significant the fact that at the same time, around 1200, we can find some traces of metempsychosis in Western Judaism and Kabbalah. Still, White the Junior confessed that Francisc was not following the teaching of the reincarnation of souls, and he did not. Neither did he support any postulates of pantheism. The worldview of Francisc and his view on the nature and human being was based on the unique type of panpsychism, that all living creatures and even non-living things are meant to glorify their Creator. I have mentioned already that since the publication of the article by White the Junior, there were many other researchers. I would like to cite one article today It's Keith Warrer. She is a Protestant. No, she is, sorry, she is a Franciscan, sorry. She has a wonderful book called Franciscan Environmental Ethics. It's an article, Imagining Creation as a Community of Care. She says that Franciscan theology of creation contains a couple of valuable theological sources for contemporary ecological ethics on individual and subjective levels, and also in the sphere of sensual experience of creation and highly developed Christ-oriented and Trinitary intuitions. Francis left behind himself an example of living by gospel and in love to all the creation. His and the Franciscan tradition represent these two aspects as deeply interconnected phenomena. Francis and his school foresee contemporary concern about environmental issues and behavior with the earth. We still have to do a lot of interpretative work and adopt his works to contemporary ethics. Bonaventura and Scott expressed Francis' teaching with the help of theological position, and this has great potential for development in the sphere of Christian ecological ethics. Franciscan tradition has been always stating that all the creation has theological and moral value. And it is this that is the most important contribution into the development of ecological ethics. This tradition has always been emphasizing that the creation has religious aim. It carries God in itself. It communicates God. It encourages people to go into deeper relationship with God. It praises God regardless of people. Calling up on the theology of incarnation and the primacy of Christ, Franciscan approach to ecological ethics is directly connected with Jesus Christ, Christian scriptures and tradition. This approach can mitigate the radical anthropocentrism of contemporary Christian thought. Let's recollect what does the notion of the primacy of Christ means. In the medieval scholastic theological thought, this was the best expressed by Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas, who borrowed this inspiration from Augustine, and it was believed that the incarnation of the Son of God was somehow predetermined by the fall of Adam. The first dated use of this term is in the Catholic Paschal Vigilia, O felix culpa quatalem et tantum meruit habere redemptorem. Or happy guilt that earned for us such great and such a glorious Redeemer. In the 4th century, Saint Ambrose of Mediolan was also talking about the happy destruction of Adam in the Eden garden, and it lied in the fact that this sin brought to humanity more welfare than it would have been without this, and if Adam remained innocent. This theological thought is also continued in the works by Ambrosius and Augustine. He says, because God believed that it is better to bring good out of evil than to allow evil to exist. The medieval theological Thomas Aquinas was quoting this line when he was explaining the principle that God simply allows for evil to happen, so that through the evil he could bring more good. And this is the main principle of the cause and consequence connection between the original sin and the incarnation of the divine, and the divine incarnation of the Savior. And thus he comes to the conclusion that sin does not limit the highest state, that the state of creation that was brought on by Christ. For Francis Assisi and his followers, Bonaventura and Duns Scott, this connection between cause and consequence was not quite clear. Bonaventura was quite well knowledgeable with patristic theological heritage of of pseudo Dionys Areopagite, Maximus Confessor, and John Damascus. It's the theological synthesis that helped him to better understand the mystical experience of Francis, who believed that God is a freedom and love, and that's why his coming into this world could not be conditioned by human deeds, even by the sin. On the contrary, his idea was to get united with the whole creation, and in the unity, it was thought from the very beginning and the design of the creation. The notion of the primacy of Christ represents this theological thesis. At the same time, Franciscal vision of Trinity as the unity of people has in itself some repercussions of theological synthesis of the fathers of Cappadocia, Basil the Great, Gregory theologian, and Gregory of Nyssa. For Francis, as we see this in his Cantico di Frate Sole or Cantico delle Creature, Trinity is a sample, is a pattern of relations among all the creatures, and all the creatures are connected and communicated with God as the source of life. Thus, communicatory cosmology inspires the shared belonging of all the creation and is the basis of the collective concern of moral community. Franciscan theology of creation can be an impetus for the development of moral vision of care as human responsibility. Christians can see creation as part of the moral community. Creation, planet Earth, with its ecosystems, are not the new spheres of interest among the contemporary ethics. For Christians, this community is an integral part of Christian calling and moral life. The ethical system of Virginia held and the Franciscan tradition similarly emphasize the awareness of the fragility of life and interconnected between things. They also pay their attention on the duty to care of others. They also cast away that approach of ethics that is based only on rationality. On the contrary, they give privilege to love, sympathy, empathy, and sensuality and tenderness. They get distance from the emphasis of contemporary moral philosophers on the universal and abstract rules. This way, Franciscan ecological ethics emphasizes on the ethics of care about the all creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father. Not only did you portray Francis of Assisi, but you also elucidated the entire tradition that was reflected in his voluminous legacy. Thank you for that. If there are any questions in the audience, I can give you a microphone. If there are no questions at this point, I would like to ask the speakers, maybe they have some responses to the presentations of one another. So maybe there's some feedback or some comments that you want to make.
Not yet. Not yet.
Якщо можна, Романе, до тебе, так, насправді ти показав.
May I have a question to you, because you demonstrated the transformations of these two pastors, and you talked about their transformation in dire times, in brutal times, the times characterized by violence, idealization, and you also mentioned that their example was relevant for our Ukrainian society, and I'm sure that this is something that you reflect on multiple occasions. So, of course, we're talking about two different realities. I mean, the Nazi Germany of the 1940s and the Ukraine-Russia war that we are experiencing right now in this hybrid form. But could you expand a little bit more on how this analogy can be of relevance and benefit to us right now? How can it be beneficial to chaplains, to pastors, to average Ukrainians? Ukrainians who feel the fear on the one hand, but on the other hand, Ukrainians who have a vision of a good Ukrainian future. Thank you very much for this good question. I don't really have any definitive answers. I only can offer some provisional or visionary answers. The personality of Andrea Tragma became a revelation for me, especially after the publication of his book. Before that, I've read a little bit about him as part of my research on the Christian hospitality, and I was really fascinated and pleasantly surprised by this figure. The situation in France was really bad after the outbreak of World War II, after the defeat. The French society doesn't really want to admit and acknowledge it, but where the Vichy government was established, that part of the country actively collaborated with the German government, and they were even more aggressive with some anti-Jewish laws than the German government. So they carried out some activities that led to the marginalization of the Jews and subsequent deportation of multiple Jews. The Catholic Church did not really have a principled stance. It's a fact as well. Of course, there were some vivid examples of people and priests and bishops who adhered to a gospel-based position, but the church was not really willing to be in open confrontation with the government. The Protestant church in France was quite small, and the Protestant church had a difficult history of persecution in the deserts for multiple centuries, so they were struggling in France as well. The Protestant church also had this experience of survival, of openness, and it was an important lesson for me. In those situations, when the rhetoric of violence and animosity is dominant, for example, when there's rhetoric related to the application of weapons, because this is something that we hear from the church representatives as well, the question is, what can we do not to be influenced by this hysteria? Because the French were pro-socialist for a long time, and they wanted to restore a more homogeneous France, and the Marshal Pétain was the figure who was able to help them with this national repentance. And this way, France wanted to get rid of some enemies. Well, I think that some of our actions are against the blood and flesh of God. And by the way, Andrea Tragma resigned right away because the management of the church condemned pacifism. So conscientious serving is like a criminal offense. He submitted a resignation letter. The church did not accept it, and there's one book about Andrea entitled The Weapons of the Spirit. So I think that we as Christians, chaplains, and all those who are related to the current conflicts should not really be influenced by these fights or rhetoric about racial purity, because even among in the gospel text or in the Christian church text, we can see some sentiments and tendencies that are not Christian-like, because the idea of non-violence were in the core of the Ukrainian Protestant church. But right now, some of these views are challenged. For me personally, Andrea Tragma had a principled stance in this regard, and he is a valuable lesson. So he would rather die himself than allow himself to participate in violence. So he had some stringent principles. He was ready to risk his life, and any anti-Semitist rhetoric was unacceptable for him. Any rhetoric that differentiated between us and the others. He was against any rhetoric that implied violence, cruelty, and aggression. In Central and Eastern Europe, we can see an avalanche of some populist right-wing regimes, and very often, in terms of their views, they are distant from Christian convictions and beliefs. And there's a multitude of publications on this topic. So they resort to Christian rhetoric, to some Christian images and symbols, but since they're not Christians themselves, they abuse the Christian rhetoric. And unfortunately, Christians are often deprived of critical thinking. So they do not really dig down to the essence of it, because a lot of these regimes are profoundly anti-Christian, because they refer to the same rhetoric that was condemned by Tragma, Bonhoeffer, in the Gospel. So I can see a lot of challenges there. Unfortunately, the wave of populism covered not only Central and Eastern Europe. This is something that we can observe in multiple corners globally. There are these entire islands that instrumentalize Christian values by calling towards pseudo discipleship. But it's a matter for a separate discussion. There was also a question from the professor, or a comment. Go ahead.
If I may. A couple of things. First, what you rightly called instrumentalization of religion is not just in Europe, and it's not just in Christian Europe. It's in many, many places, and it's a very interesting phenomena and a dangerous phenomena. But I want to add a couple of things to this discussion and then pull out some analytic points. It took the French a generation, 30 years, to admit their complicity in the murder of 75,000 Jews in France. To a great extent, what opened the gates was the denial of the Holocaust in France and the trials. And only in the 1970s did people begin to face the responsibility of the French. Only later did they begin to admit that the people who rounded up the Jews in Paris and elsewhere were not German soldiers, but French police. This took 30 years to admit. And it's very important to recognize now. I want to add something important, which is complicating. So it's true, and I'm sure it's true in this village that there were French Jews and non-French Jews. Yet it remains the fact that the vast majority of the 75,000 murdered Jews in France were not French citizens. Were refugees, were people who ran away from Poland, from Germany, from elsewhere. So this is interesting. So the French Jews from Metz, from Strasbourg, from their established French families were saved. They belonged. So the issue of belonging is central here. We have also the story Bulgaria saved its Jews, those who belonged, but the 12,000 Jews in northern Macedonia, which were under Bulgarian sovereignty at that period, were deported with Bulgarian help, complicity, police, army, and trains. So this issue of belonging is terribly important, especially, and we saw here in these two presentations, what's so different about Tragma and Bonhoeffer and the discussion of Maidan is precisely about belonging. what was really almost historically unique here was the willingness to suffer martyrdom for the other, for somebody who's not you, not your community. And this is unique. It's difficult enough. It's too much already to demand of people to suffer martyrdom for their own, let alone to go beyond it. So I think we have to recognize this, to begin to recognize this distinction between the type of self-sacrifice that is done for what we consider our own and for what we consider another. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind. That's all I wanted to say.
Так, було ще питання, я пам'ятаю, з залу, так?
There was one more question, I remember.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Roman Solovey and to Adam Seligman. I would like to hear your response to the presentation by Father Demid. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, Andrei Smirnov asked whether we can differentiate between religious martyrdom and political martyrdom. And His Grace, Job Getcha, said that in Greece they have this concept of ethnomartyria. So basically these are martyrs for the faith, for Greek independence, and it's very difficult to figure out what they are ready to suffer for. So they are martyrs, but they basically suffer and sacrifice martyrdom for both things, the faith and independence. The same happened on the Maidan. People died. It's difficult to put our finger on what exactly they died for. For some people, Maidan might have been an act of politics, while for others it was a religious act. Father Demid portrayed this religious picture, but there were a lot of non-believers there. There were a lot of non-Christians on the Maidan. So we cannot really interpret everything through the Eucharistic ethos. So I have a question to Roman. Through the prism of Bonhoeffer, who fought against nationalism, how can we approach this issue and view this issue safely? And also have a question to Adam. I think that this differentiation between the religious and the political is more of Christian nature than Judaic character, because Judaism does not really view itself as a religion, as a nation, beyond this dichotomy. So what is the approach of Judaism in these matters? So what is dying for your people? What is dying for God? And does this Christian differentiation mean anything for Judaism? Pablo, thank you very much for your questions. As for Bonhoeffer, he experienced a serious evolution. The early Bonhoeffer is this classical Lutheran pastor, and for him there was no big difference between the nation and the church back then. Being a German meant being a Lutheran, being a Lutheran meant being a German. It was a part and parcel of the German culture that shaped for centuries and centuries. And when World War I broke out, two of his brothers volunteered to fight in the front line, and one brother died at the age of 18 after just 1 month of military service, and the other brother became an enemy of the German nationalism, having witnessed the atrocities of the war. But then Bonhoeffer went to Barcelona. He also worked in Germany with young people. So for a long time he was a sort of German conservative. That's how I would describe him. But when he finds himself in the US, when he meets the Ethiopian Baptist Church, it's a free evangelical church. He's also exposed to the peacekeeping movement, and he experienced a profound transformation. So he went beyond the Lutheran teaching. If we read his classical publications and papers, he takes the Sermon on the mountain from this classical Lutheran understanding. So it's not only about living in line with God, he turned it more towards the Baptist tradition. So he viewed it more as the rule of life. So the church is not something identical to the nation. We cannot really say that you become a Christian by default because you are a German. It's more about people making a conscious choice to live in compliance with the ethics of this Sermon on the Mountain. And Barth's influence was there. The Christ demonstrated what God was, and the task of a Christian is to live like the Christ did. So that was the ethics that accompanied Barth until the end of his life. But Bonhoeffer, I think, would not really agree to this merging of national martyrs and martyrs for faith. So I think that he would really differentiate between the two categories. And by the way, there's another conflict that he experienced. I didn't really have enough time to mention it. His conflict related to his service in Arber. He did that because he didn't want to join the army. He knew that he would not be able to take to the arms. So he had to join the Arber. It was related to some family issues and connections as well. In the end, it became part of his conspiracy against Hitler. But there are multiple discussions on this topic. Would Bonhoeffer accept that he was described as a co-conspirator against Hitler? But for him, these basic Christian principles were essential, and he differentiated between the national political strife against Hitler and this non-violent pacifist position of the church. So, like you, I have my reservations about putting together people who died for political national values and martyrs who died for their faith to the Christ. In my personal view, this is a subject for discussion and more profound exploration. This is my answer to your question.
Just a quick replica. I think in this, in answering this question, we kind of forget about one thing. Calling on what Reverend Mikhailo Demid said, we are not talking here about martyrs who perished for some political issues or for the grandiosity of the nation, country, or for spreading their country borders, but for the dignity and freedom of their people. So this is perishing as a service, as a consequence of service to their people, not for political ideals, but for the dignity of people. That's death for the other. I think there is a huge Christian element present here. We are sometimes omitting it. Perhaps.
You know the Jewish joke about why does a Jew always answer a question with a question? And the answer is, why shouldn't a Jew answer a question with a question? So my answer on the one hand would be, how much time do you have if you want an answer? But I'll try a bit to at least open it. So I have to start with the fact that Judaism does not look at martyrdom the way Christianity does. And that itself is rooted in the fact that Judaism is not at all about asceticism. Asceticism is not a value in Judaism. The denial of bodily drives and urges is not a value in Judaism. Channeling is, yes, regulating them, but not denying them. So this is the place to start. So in traditional Jewish thought, there's an important notion of Mavet al Kiddush Hashem. In other words, death for the sanctification of God. Now, if you look at the text, take the sort of echte normative text of Maimonides, this should be done in very, very rare circumstances. In very rare circumstances. If somebody forces you to eat pork, eat it, enjoy. Only if what is demanded is adultery, murder, or idolatry, which what is idolatry is not clear. Only those three circumstances demand of you to die for the sanctification of God's name. So it's not a value per se, as it is in different ways in Christianity. It's also not rooted in that sort of attitude of denial of this worldliness. Judaism is a very this worldly religion. Now it becomes interesting with the Jewish state. It becomes interesting what you do in this strange mixture of state and religion, because it's a Jewish state and religion has, I think, unfortunately, a very strong role in the state. Became even more complicated after the 1980s with the vast influence, immigration of Russians, many who claimed to be Jewish and were not Jewish, and served in the army and are killed. What's their role? How do you bury them? How do you understand them? How do you conceptualize them? And the authorities deal with this. Now, at one level, we call, but I think it's more rhetorical than liturgical, although it's part of the liturgy. When we say the prayers for the dead, we call all of them kedoshim, all of them holy. These soldiers who died or people who died in the resistance before, victims of terror, in Israel, in America, wherever, Jewish and non-Jewish. So they're called holy, but that's not martyrs. That's not yet martyrs, and it's not, certainly not Mavet al Kiddush Hashem, death for the sanctification of God's name. So I think it might change, but I think there is still a distinction between dying for the polis, and we are now in a position that we never were in before, where non-Jews may die for the polis, and the closest to your notion of martyrdom is Mavet al Kiddush Hashem, dying for the sanctification of God's name, which is a sort of different act. You had a very interesting thing now. Soldiers who die, so according to Jewish law, then non-Jews are not allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. But these are soldiers, and they need to be buried with military honors in a military cemetery, like any other soldiers. So they come up with a nice thing. If you look carefully at that segment of the cemetery, there's a very, very small, very low border of flowers around those non-Jewish graves, right? So you can have it both ways. You can, in terms of statlish needs, they're buried with full military honors in the military cemetery and so on, but actually there's just the smallest of symbolic boundaries. And one of the things that happened in the horrible terrorist attack in the Dolphinarium, where the young people were a disco, and I don't know, 17 people were murdered, many of them non-Jews. And the city, this was a Friday night, so the city immediately buried them, and the religion, and the parents were angry because they were buried in not as sort of martyrs, civic martyrs. And the religious people said, you're crazy, you should have called us. We know how to do this. We know how to do this so that it can fulfill both needs. But what's recognized is both, is that they're separate. Is that the beginning of an answer? Okay.
Окей, дякую. Ще отець Іван, моє питання.
Я вчора вже про це трохи говорив.
Reverend Ivan Dacko, I spoke about this yesterday. I loved this expression, job getcha, that church is not, the factory that produces saints. I will strike a joke. I was a great friend of Father Rieden van Strater, and everybody would tell him, you are a saint, and I was telling him, you are not a saint, you are just a great person. You like to look at nice and nice looking women, although you are a monk. And I was telling him straight into his eyes. He's a Ukrainian from diaspora. We at UCAS know him. He had a great value. He valued greatly all the national heroes. only now, at the rule of Pope Francis, because at the time of the Pope Benedict, they somehow didn't come to it. But now they are trying to reform all the beatification and canonization procedures. I mentioned this yesterday. The distinction between the beatified and saints was made by Father Urban VIII, and before that there were many centuries of saints. So it was purely scholastic. If Dietrich Bonhoeffer were a Catholic, he would have been proclaimed martyr. Luther was against this. Leave it up to God. I know that among Italians and French, there was a kind of competition, a contest that every founder of an order, a monastic order, sooner or later has to be proclaimed a saint. Unfortunately, this is not cynicism. I was working in Rome and in Vatican for a long time. Little do you know, you have no idea how ecclesiastic and non-ecclesiastic lawyers make their money on this. Joseph Slipy was collecting for beatification of Metropolitan Sheptytsky, and $300,000 they gathered. 36 years ago, who proclaimed Volodymyr? We are not talking about the reception of God's people or people as such. Neither Pope nor Kievan Metropolitan with his synod, or Kievan Patriarchate with its synod, simply received the will of people. Volodymyr, Olha now, Olha is blessed. We know that there is Saint Augustine, Boris, Gleb, and Anthony. He was beatified by Urban. I think this is significant. I was very overjoyed that Pope proclaimed our new martyrs. But you know, we have some people who live according to the book and to the word of law, and we are not supposed to venerate Vladika Chernetsky because he was only blessed and beatified. He's not a saint. But you know what? I was mentioning this yesterday. If I am within Ukraine, you are beatified. If I go beyond the limits of Ukraine, you cease to be such. So this is stupid. I will try to talk about this to our patriarch, because I think that current Pope wants to give back the rights to the Orthodox churches, and at least to grant the right for the patriarchs to develop new procedures for beatification and canonization. It was mentioned about Heavenly 100. We don't know whether there were some better or worse girls and boys, but they are great people, like Genrich van Straten. He loved money, he loved to drink wine, he loved nice girls, but martyrdom washes away all those sins. That's why within the early church, martyrdom gave a visa-free regime of access to heavenly kingdom. And we have now entered such different complications that a simple guy would not get it. This is what I wanted to say. So let's try not to classify all the saints by the different drawers, because sanctity is all about living by the heroism of virtues. It's already heroism. I lay my head, am I Christian or not, for the freedom of Ukraine. This is to comply with what we've been saying. Due to the lack of time, there is only one question from Christina Mekaluk, and it's addressed to Professor Seligman. I will read it out in English.
Educational role. Can it be the first step in bringing forth a certain culture, certain vision of good society, and once this culture is a place, the law becomes redundant? To connect it with the issue of ecological crisis and sustainability, should we create more laws, especially international laws, to bring about the transition of our societies of sustainability, or should we better educate the minds and hearts first? Sure.
Your English is great, but I had this on. I didn't realize. So for St. Paul, of course, law was a propedeutic. Law for St. Paul, law was a first step, which is a very particular conception of law, and you know is absolutely legitimate within its frame. I learned a wonderful expression when I was in Bulgaria, which is that law is a door in the field. In other words, you could always go around it. I don't know if you have such a conception here. And in Confucian thought in China, in classical Chinese thought, there is a debate about the relative, not even a debate, it's clear, the relative values of Fa and Li. Fa is law, and Li is correct practice and ritual, right? And clearly, Li is preferable to Fa, because any law that you posit could also be argued against, or else our lawyers and judges and courts and the whole apparatus would have no work. So that I would see Fa as correct practice and coming out of the latter option presented in the question. In other words, education and learning and not being forced categorically into a legal position.
Дякую тоді. Хочу тоді вже подякувати всім нашим доповідачам, які були з нами.
Thank you very much. I want to express gratitude to our speakers that have been with us all this time. Thank you for wonderful presentations that arouse a lot of speculations in us. By this third session, we close a series of sessions of the Ukrainian Christian Academic Society. I want to extend gratitude to Renovabis Foundation that is currently supporting the activity of the society, also to the participants who participated in these sessions. We continue our activities. We will have our seminar next. I want to announce it on the 29th of November. We will have our General Assembly. It's our internal information. Oh, sorry, on the 20th of October. Okay, just follow the information that will be provided on the Institute site and will be also promoted through the site and email. Thank you for participation. And one announcement that tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we still have upcoming events within the framework of the Social Ecumenical Week. Please be with us. There are lots of events coming. Thank you.